Welcome and good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I don't know where you're watching from or what time you're seeing it, so I have to welcome you in every single way. Well, church members, friends of Loma Linda University, we want to welcome you to another live conversation event. If you're joining us tonight, it's because Pastor Joey and I are recording this on Friday evening here in Loma Linda. But those of you across the world, you might be seeing this and it's already Saturday morning or afternoon. And so we want to welcome those of you who are watching from across the country and different places. So if you could do something for me as we begin this live Q&A with Pastor Joey, could you tell us, where are you watching from? Where are you watching from tonight? We'd love to hear from you. So if you can just start posting that. And also, what has been the most significant thing God has done in your life since COVID started? Where are you from? And what's one of the most significant things that's happened in your life? Well, I want to bring on my good friend and colleague, Pastor Joey O, who is our administrative pastor and also the leader for our young professional ministry, Rooted. Joey, welcome, brother.
It's good to be with you tonight, Philip. Happy Sabbath, everyone. Good to see you.
Well, thanks so much, Joey, for being part of this. Good to see you, man.
Yeah, I always enjoy coming on and having this conversation with you, Philip.
Hey, now tell me, you went on a little vacation. What'd you do?
We got away, got into nature, did a lot of hiking.
Good.
Yeah.
Who was the slowest in the pack? You or?
I don't think I can say that online.
Oh, okay. We won't get you in trouble. All right. Well, Joey, you preached a sermon this weekend on cross-cultural conversations. I just want to know, when you were coming up with this whole series, now some of our church members don't know this, but Pastor Joey was the curator of this entire series that we're in right now. Why did you think that cross-cultural conversations should be part of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, the series, like you said, we came up with this series way back in January, and we weren't, that was before all of this sort of blew up in our country. But even back then, there was a sense that there are just some hot button topics that we need to talk about, but we have a hard time talking about, right?
Yeah. So
that this was one of them. And I felt like even though it would be difficult, it would be important to. Although at the time when we were working through the details of the sermon series, I didn't think I would be the one having to address it, but it ended up being that way. So, and actually, the title we picked was cross-racial conversations, not cross-culture. And I think we can talk a little bit about the difference between race and culture a little bit later.
Yes, I would love to hear from that. Okay. Well, we just want to say a few kind of hellos and welcomes. Joey, maybe you can say hello to someone here. I'll say hi to Denvor Robertson from South Africa.
Wow. All the way from South Africa. Happy Sabbath. I think it's Sabbath over there.
6 a.m. 6 a.m.
Oh, so my
glad
goodness.
You're with us, brother.
Wow. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. And want to say hi to Georgia Firestone Barrett. You're watching from Camplin Bay in San Diego. That's awesome. I'm going to be in San Diego tomorrow at noon, Georgia. I'm going to do a baptism down there. So I'll wave to you in the area. And want to say hi to Margaret Major from New South Wales, Australia. And she was answering the question that I posed, what was one of the most significant things that's happened to you? And she said, during COVID, most significant thing, healing from major foot surgery done on 5th of March and more time to do spiritual posts on Facebook during this convalescence. That's awesome. And we want to say hi to Greta Dawson as well. So glad that you're all with us. We're really excited for this conversation. So Joey, why don't we jump into it right now?
Let's do it.
One of the first questions, Joey, that I have for you was just more of a general question in terms of your pastoral career. You know, pastors have some tough conversations they have to have with people, either someone with them or they with other people. What's one of the most challenging conversations you've had to have during your pastoral career?
Yeah, there's been a lot. A lot of them. One that sort of sticks in my mind is when I was a youth pastor, so quite a while ago.
Okay.
When I was a youth pastor, I was just starting at this church. I think I had been there only less than a month. And I received a phone call from a very irate parent whose son was apparently bullied during Vacation Bible School by, son was like in 5th grade, and he was bullied by a couple of boys in the 6th grade. And I didn't know about it. I didn't even hear that this had happened. This is my first time hearing about it. And he was so angry. And it was just like, and I understand if my children were bullied, I would be angry and frustrated too. And so he was saying things like, you know, why didn't you stop this? Why didn't you step in? You're a terrible person. You're a terrible pastor. And he ended the conversation with telling me that if this is the way that I'm going to be as a pastor, I should just quit ministry and leave now.
Wow.
And you know, this is actually my first assignment. I'm only a month in. It was difficult to hear. But I think as challenging as that conversation was, and it was challenging, I think it was more challenging to come back to him and have a conversation reconciling. That was, you know, because I was, you know, honestly, I was angry because I didn't think I deserved the anger. And it took a lot of processing to realize, you know, there are reasons for him to be angry too. I understand his frustration and not just be focused on why is he pouring this out on me when I don't deserve it, right? So that conversation was probably the harder conversation of the two.
Did you end up getting to a place where you resolved this with them, or did it just
did actually? Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we did. We eventually got there, and we worked on some projects together even. And so
really,
yeah, eventually
so this person that chewed you out like that ended up becoming a good person that you could work with.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's something to that actually, Joey.
Yeah.
When we talk about, you know, the intensity by which some of these issues that we're facing right now, I think if we can realize that there's more that unites us and that there's more kind of in the background in our personal life, I wonder if we could get to places where we can still not only be friends, but then be work the kingdom work together in spite of our differences of opinion. And I mean, wow, what a perfect example of working through a tough situation with someone and then ending up on the better side.
That's a really good point, Philip, because I mean, I think that's why conversations have so much power, because they have the power to resolve conflict in a way that if you just ignored it and let it simmer, that it would just build, right?
Yeah.
So that really, well said, Philip.
Yeah. Wow. It's all you, what you went through. That's amazing. Joey, tell me now in this regard, a lot of people I've heard, and I've personally experienced this, when I started discussing issues of race relations in our young adult ministry, I had a couple people come to me and say, hey, Pastor, why are you getting political now? And in my head, I guess I didn't see it that way. And so the question is, if people look at racial injustice as a political issue, why talk about race in the church space? Why bring politics into the pulpit?
That's a good question. A hard one. Thanks, Philip. I appreciate it.
I'm glad you're answering this.
You know, I understand the sentiment. race has become so polarized and so politicized. And when we come to church, a lot of times what we want is we want peace, and we want just a message about Christ and reconciliation and all of that. And to bring in a topic that is so divisive, if it's just really uncomfortable, it's hard to hear. So I totally understand when someone says, I just don't want to hear about that. I'm hearing about it everywhere else. It's all over the news cycle. It's all over my social media feed. Why do we have to encounter it when we come to church too? So I totally get that. But if we take race out of the equation for a second and we just talk about justice is one of the main themes of Scripture. Right? I mean, especially the prophets, particularly the prophets, just talk about justice over and over and over again, to the point where they even talk about things like, if you are not doing justice for the widows and the oppressed and the orphans and the foreigners, right? If you're being unjust to them, then don't even come. Don't even come to worship me. I don't want your offerings, right? We just, in our prayer connection time, we read through a passage in Amos chapter 5, where God is basically listing all the injustices of his people, among his people. And then he says in verse 21, let me read this passage to you.
So Amos chapter 5.
With verse 21.
Verse 21.
He writes, I hate, he says, I hate, I despise, I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer up to me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, and I will not even look at the peace offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But, verse 24, but let justice roll down like waters, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Wow.
So justice itself is an act of worship to God, right? And we see this with Jesus too. I mean, Jesus fought for justice, not just in the future when he returns again, but even here on earth. Like when he cast people out of the temple, when he threw them out of the temple, these money changers, he said that the reason why he threw them out was because my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. For all nations. And it makes a lot more sense when you realize that where these people were set up in the temple, Philip, you probably know this, that there were different sections in the temple courtyard or the temple for different types of people. There were the male Jews, right? And then the women who were Jews, and then there were the foreigners, the Gentiles courtyard area. And they were set up in the Gentiles courtyard area with all of these booths. So there was just basically no room in God's house for foreigners. And that's why Jesus was coming in to clear out that space, was to make room for people that these people of God had basically kicked out of the church.
Wow. I was talking to a young adult just recently, Joey, on this very issue. There have been several young adults that had just really made some poor decisions and had hurt people in our community, and they ended up getting some really harsh statements from church members, kind of like, you're just not welcome back here anymore. We're really sorry, but as a result of what you did, you just can't be part of this community any longer. And it hurts when you realize you're on the outside looking in, and you're not able to get access to a place that you believe healing is found, especially when maybe you've been the one to cause a wrong. But then how much more so when we think about race issues, like I haven't done anything wrong, but the color of my skin, or the awkwardness of my speech, or the gender that I am, or you just name the issues that keeps me isolated from everyone else. Man, Joey, that is such a powerful text, brother.
Wow. Yeah. And the Bible's full of them. I was just flipping through some other passages, and this is not the only prophet that speaks about this. Isaiah speaks about this. Ezekiel speaks about this. It's found throughout.
Wow. Now, Joey, you talk about a unique phrase in your sermon. Those who are watching this evening here in California, or those across the world watching it, you won't be able to see it until the morning here on our time. But you use this phrase called categorization processes. So now explain what categorization processes are, and how might they exist in the church when it comes to these issues of race?
So to put it simply, categorization processes are our brain's way of conserving energy and helping us to remember things more efficiently, right? So our brains have a limited ability to pay attention and process information. And most of us are flooded with way too much information, way more than we can handle. And so to cope, our brains sort of conserve mental energy by selectively choosing what to pay attention to. So Philip, if your wife ever says to you, honey, why aren't you paying more attention to me? You can just say to her, well, honey, it's because my brain is a cognitive miser. It's not that I don't love you, honey. It's my brain is, no, don't say that to her. If you say that to her, she may become a compassion miser to you.
Oh my goodness. Philip, sleep in the other room is what she'll say.
No, but that's what our brain does. And I mean, we notice this all the time, right? Like, why is it that we pick up on certain details and we miss completely what other details are there? I know that there have been several times when I preach a sermon and somebody's come to me and they thank me for something that I said. And I wondered to myself, did I actually say that in my sermon? I'm not sure that I actually said that. But because of the way our brains work, they just latch onto certain things in certain ways. So that's basically what cognitive categorization processes are. They're our brain's way of just conserving energy by grouping things in broad categories and then just filling in the blanks for itself.
Yeah. Now, could you use almost the word the assumptions in there? We make a lot of assumptions about things based on previous knowledge of something or how we view certain things, and we just almost assume, well, this is what it's probably about.
Yeah, definitely. Assumptions happen because that's what categorization processes do. They fill in information that doesn't exist. So if I don't know someone very well, my brain will naturally try to fill in the blanks of information about them. So the less that I say this in the sermon, the less I know about someone, the more I assume about them.
Okay. So now let's take this then into the issue of race. How does that work?
Yeah.
And then in the church in particular.
Well, it means that racism happens because we have these cognitive processes, because our brains naturally connect pieces of information, even when those pieces of information are not necessarily related together. So we will connect a person's skin color, for example, to some kind of trait because we've known several people that have that skin color and have that trait. All of a sudden, our minds make a connection. Oh, okay. So if you have that skin color, then you have that trait, right? So if you're Black, you're athletic, right? So we know a lot of Black athletes, and so our minds just make that connection. And unless we take time to really check those assumptions, they sort of just run in the background without us even realizing they're happening and guide our thought processes. That's how these cognitive processes are attached to racism.
Now, do you think that, Joey, people actually will walk into a church and make those kind of assumptions about one another? Or do you think when you walk into church, you're almost kind of this mental decision, everyone here is my brother and sister. I cannot judge any of them because for Christ calls me not to judge, but to love,
Yeah. I mean, I wish that were the case, but there seems to be some evidence that isn't. I do believe that the more we get to know someone, the less of those assumptions kick in, right? So, people talk about being colorblind, and I do think it's possible to be, this is just me talking, right? I do think it's possibly to become colorblind when you know someone well, right? So as I get to know you, Philip, as I've gotten to know you, I don't think of you as Philip, the white guy, right? I think of you as Philip, my friend, who's good at basketball and who has a great sense of humor and loves to hug people. I mean,
Keep it going, Joey.
that's now all that information has been filled in, and I don't need to use my assumptions anymore. The challenge is the church isn't just filled with people that we know very well.
Yeah.
And so the less we know someone, the more our assumptions kick in. That's a little bit different.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate when we take into church with us the negative understandings we have of people. I think church should be the place where there should be at least I guess you could call it a neutral standing, where if someone comes to church, you can make, would you say you could make this assumption? They've come to find God, and giving almost them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they've come to find a wife, or they've come to just find community. But at least here, that there's one unifying factor most likely amongst us all, and therefore you can give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. I think that's a great phrase, giving people the benefit of the doubt, because I think that's a lot what's missing from this cross-racial conversation is we don't always give the other person the benefit of the doubt. In fact, sometimes we sort of, especially if it's somebody that is on the other side of the issue, whatever side you're on, right? If it's something we perceive as being on the other side of the issue, then we almost like interpret into their words a lot.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I do think, though, there is another way that race enters into the church that's a little bit higher level than just the interpersonal relationships. And that's even the way that we perceive God, I do think. And my eyes were kind of open to this by reading a book by Daniel Hill. He's a pastor in Chicago who tried to launch a cross-cultural church in Chicago. And if you know anything about Chicago, Chicago is one of the most diverse cities in the United States. I mean, it's one of the most diverse cities, but it's also one of the most divided and segregated cities. Like, people live in their areas and they don't go out of their areas, right? Wow. So you can know where you can almost know where someone lives by like what sports team they follow. Like if they follow if they follow the White Sox versus following the Cubs, right? You know where they lie. So it's a very, very divided city. And he tried to start a church there. And in that process, he came to a realization about himself. And that was that he carried a certain theology within him that he assumed was just Christian theology. But as he studied it, he realized that it was actually, there was so much culture involved in his theology too. And here's how he came to that realization. He had a mentor who, as he was going through this journey, invited him to list the top 5 preachers that he followed and the top 5 theologians he followed. Write their names down, just write them all down. And then when he looked at that list, he realized that every single person on that list was a white man. There were no women at all. They were all white. And then he realized, oh my goodness, my theology is a white cultural theology, which is, he hadn't even thought of that before. But then he goes on to talk about why is it that when we talk about theologies from other cultures or other races, when we talk about theology from other cultures, we add a prefix to it. Like we talk about liberation theology, which
Yeah.
is from South America, right?
Hispanic countries. Yeah.
Yeah. Why do we have to label it as some different type of theology? But when it is just standard, theology that came from white cultures, we just call it theology.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's sort of the realization that he came to.
Mm,
And I'm still
mm,
processing that,
mm.
but I can see another way that
Wow.
race enters into the church.
One of my professors that I had for a time at Fuller Theological Seminary, he was known as a global theologian, Dr. Veli Karkanen, and he would write a book about a certain doctrine. He was is a systematic theologian. He would include Asian, African, Hispanic, like a theologian from each part of the world in his writing, just so that he would ensure he would have a well-balanced global theology. I think there's something to that.
Yeah.
Now, Joey, I was thinking about this word race, and some people confuse that with culture. Maybe you can give us a proper understanding of that.
Okay, so this is my understanding. Again, I'm not an expert about any of this, but the way that I've seen it defined most helpfully is that culture has to do with internal characteristics like our language, our worldviews, the types of foods we like to eat. That's culture. But race really has to do with external characteristics like the color of our skin, the shape of our eyes, the color of our hair, right? So you can be of one race, but have different cultures. For example, if you see a Black person walking on the street, they are racially Black, but they may be culturally Nigerian. They may be African American. They may be French, right? They may be British. Just by looking at the external race, you can't make a determination about their culture, right? So that's the difference.
Yeah.
We sometimes correlate those things and assume that all people who are of a certain race have a certain culture, but that's not necessarily true.
Wow, that's really good. In my family, if I'm getting a little personal here, just to give a little taste of this. So my brother is white, my sister-in-law is Black racially, and they've been asked, hey, wow, how do you guys get along? They actually get along really well because culturally they're very similar. My sister-in-law is kind of a very multicultural individual, raised in France most of her life, as well as in Africa. Her parents are missionaries, conservative theology, similar to us, Eastern Europe culture, so they have so much in common, but people look at them and say, oh my goodness, you guys must be so different.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a great explanation that you gave, which is culturally people can be very similar, though they may look very different racially.
Yes.
I think that's a really great point. Thank you, Joey. Now, one kind of follow-up to that then, when you think about race and having representation in a church, so having my race represented in this church, whether it's in leadership, whether it's teachers, Bible teachers, or just in general representation, why is that important to see someone who looks like me?
Yeah. I think actually the story, that's the heart-to-heart conversation, that's going to be shown, I believe, during the worship service this week, really answers that well. Because as these two young ladies that are having this conversation, they talk about how growing up, the only stories they had, the only history they were taught about Black Americans was in the context of slavery, right? So that was all the stories that. So and even when growing up, as they were learning this history, one of their friends would turn to them and say, just kind of jokingly, "Ha ha, my great grandfather could have owned your great-great-grandfather, right?
Mm.
And just not, kids are kids, but not realizing how that would be offensive or hurtful to her. It was just kind of a joke, it's not, wow, what a funny coincidence, we have a connection but growing up, getting that message, it was almost like, that's the past, that's my past. It's a past that I need to be ashamed of, right? Because, I came from slaves and you came from like plantation owners, right? So having that messaging is such a challenge, because living under this perspective that that paints us as being inferior it's hard to live with. One way that I try to just kind of paint it for myself is in the context of like sports. So I like to play basketball, right?
You do.
I'm not
At
always
least you did. You did
I
like to
did
play.
before COVID hit. And when I come to play basketball, I'm this short Asian guy, right? And you don't see very many short Asian guys out there in the NBA playing basketball, right? And so I come in almost with a chip on my shoulder of having to prove that I'm good at basketball so that people will pass to me. And it's not just that it's in my mind. I've experienced it. Like when I come onto the court, and if I walk onto the court and another guy walks into the court, and I'm this like 5'7.5" Asian dude, and he is a 6'4" black dude, right? And you have not seen either of us play, and we're both on your team. Who are you more likely to pass the ball to?
6'4" guy.
Yeah, the 6'4" guy, right? So I would play a lot at like LA Fitness and before, when I had a membership there, and I would never get the ball. Like nobody would ever pass me the ball. So it was almost like I felt this pressure whenever I got the ball not to make a mistake and to do well. Like that first shot that I took was so crucial. Like if I made that first shot, then I got the ball more. If I missed it, I never saw the ball again, right? And so a lot of sports, it's very mental, right? It's very there's a physical dynamic to it, but it's also a mental dynamic to it. And having to play with that pressure every time I got on the court, it was a little bit exhausting. Now, that's just me in engaging in something fun that really has no meaning or bearing on my life, right? But if I had to live with that mindset every day, the mindset that people are judging me a certain way, like just because they see me, they judge me a certain way. If I had to live with that mindset every single day, that would be exhausting.
Yeah.
I can't see how that wouldn't impact the way that I behave, regardless of whether other people everybody does that or not. Because there may be some people who know Asian guys that play basketball well and maybe give me the benefit of the doubt, right?
Yeah.
But whether or not that person, other people perceive me that way or not, if that's the mindset that's based on my own experience that I'm carrying constantly, it's exhausting, and it does impact. It does impact the way that I play basketball, and if that was my life, it would impact the way that I live my life.
Wow. I you could say was fortunate enough to come to America early enough that I don't have a hard accent. People still tell me I have an accent.
Yeah.
But my siblings, my parents, they still have a little bit more of a harder accent. Mom and dad, a little bit more. And when you think about people who come from a different country, Africa, Asia, any Hispanic nation, India, and someone comes to you with broken English, you almost make an assumption about them. And these are the stereotypes. Well, they're probably not that smart.
Yeah.
They can barely speak English. Right? Exactly. And that's the unfortunate thing, I think, that happens when you have a certain exterior that is different than the normal culture. But I think we've dubbed something normal inappropriately, maybe. Certain things are normal. Well, it should be, I don't know. When it comes to these issues, we really are very judgmental of one another. I had a neighbor who was from the Philippines, one of my best friends, Cornel Lopez, PT, right now. And he was from the Philippines. And then another friend of mine was from Nigeria, Benjamin Kanjira. And his dad was a pastor out there. And it was the best thing. It was like the UN hanging out, and we're great friends. I was from former Yugoslavia, and here's this black guy, and here's this lighter skinned brown guy, and here's this white dude, and we're all friends and we're having a good relationship together. And it happens that we could love one another, I think, because we were children and we hadn't built up those stereotypes about culture. And that's why I almost think when Jesus says, hey, blessed are the children, for they shall, kind of will lead us into the kingdom. They, I think, are naive to what we as adults are bringing into relationships. So many presuppositions, assumptions, stereotypes that are just negative about one another. We don't give that benefit of the doubt to each other.
Yeah. Wow. That's so true.
Yeah. And I think children inherit negative stereotypes from mom and dad.
Yeah. And that seems to suggest that race isn't inherent in our minds. It's something that we create, right? This idea of race is to divide people. It's just another way, just arbitrarily dividing people from other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Margaret, I'm glad that you agree with me that children don't have those hang-ups. That's awesome. And Greta, you're saying that Pastor Joey is really good about basketball. I like that. That's good. That's good. And I want to just kind of read this comment here from Christy Richardson. She says that the Adventist culture has some strands of consistency around the world. Our value on missions has given many the opportunity to be with our siblings in Christ far and wide and learn the beauty of other cultures. I really do agree with that. I think that is one benefit of being a global church. I think that's one thing. I don't like to use the term take pride in, but I think there's something beautiful in that. The Adventist denomination is one of the most diverse communities.
Yeah.
And that is something so exciting. So exciting. Yeah.
It is beautiful. I mean, there's many other churches have fallen apart because it is hard. It is hard when you have all of these different perspectives and cultures to stay together as a church, right? And a lot of churches out there have fallen apart and are not a global church anymore because of that. They just said, you know what? You just kind of do your thing and we'll do our thing and we'll just separate from each other and not be connected anymore. But our church is still that. And there's something beautiful that we can learn from each other if we're willing to listen.
Yeah. Joey, let's jump to one of the concepts in your sermon. And this was from the Good Samaritan. Jesus talking to a rich young man, and he gives this example, and then he kind of questions back, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus then begins this parable. When it comes to answering the question, who is my neighbor in a church setting, or even maybe in a neighborhood, how do we answer that?
Yeah, I'd like to actually refer to the words of Ellen White. She has this beautiful quote about this passage that sort of answers that question from Christ Object Lessons. She writes, Jesus showed that our neighbor does not mean merely one of the church or faith to which we belong. It has no reference to race, color, or distinction. Our neighbor is every person who needs our help. Our neighbor is every soul who is wounded and bruised by the adversary. Our neighbor is everyone who is the property of God.
Wow.
So according to how she describes it, and I think she's absolutely correct when you read this passage, that our neighbor is everyone, of course, but especially everyone who is in need of help,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Which is
mm.
basically everyone, because we're all in need of help.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Now, in the story, this man physically showed that he had need. I think one kind of unfortunate reality in church, Joey, you correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe you can add to it, but it seems as though we come to church with our church clothes on, and therefore we come with our church problems in a very diminished way. It's like we're not real with each other. Well, I've put on my church attire. I can't be too real with everyone, because if they knew what really is going on in my life, then they wouldn't think I should even be here. I'm struggling in my marriage. I don't have my finances in order. We can't pay rent. I lost my job. My teenager hates me. We can't have a good relationship. I'm dying inside at work. All these things. And it's like, I don't know who I can really help or call on as my neighbor sometimes, because I kind of put a facade, a mask on.
Yeah. I mean, we all do that, right? We wear our masks because it's scary to be vulnerable. That's why, honestly, we do foot washing at our church, right? We do ordinance of humility, it's called. But for me personally, it's harder to have my feet washed than to be the one washing feet, personally, right? Because there is an element of vulnerability, right? Especially maybe if you didn't wash your feet that well that morning, you didn't take a shower or whatever before coming to church, or maybe
Cut your nails.
you didn't cut your nails, they're growing a little bit long. It's we don't normally like show our feet to people like that. So there is an element of vulnerability there. There's an element of vulnerability, and it's scary to be vulnerable. So even if people are saying, no, we're not going to judge you, we accept you, we love you as you are, which we haven't always been the best at saying or doing or showing with our lives, but even if that's happening, it's hard to be vulnerable.
It's painful. It's painful to be vulnerable, and yet, I mean, I wouldn't say don't be vulnerable in church, but I think at times we do need to be a little bit thoughtful with who we're being vulnerable with and how much we are sharing. There are people who don't know how to hold our pain well or safely.
Yes.
For their safety and for our own. Some people don't recognize or know really that they've been gossiping all their life, and so when someone comes to you and they share something of hurt and pain and hardship, it doesn't mean like you can share that as a prayer request in the next group you go meet with. It doesn't mean you can tell your other church girlfriend or guy that you like. It's a tough thing to know who to open up to, and who to be vulnerable with. And I'm a pastor, and I'm saying that.
Yeah. Which is why I think it's so important, if someone is vulnerable with us, it's so important how we respond to that, right? Because we have to realize how hard it was for them to get to that place where they were willing to share their suffering or share their pain with us. Right? It took a lot to get to that place, and how we hold that in our hands, like you were describing, I think that's a perfect metaphor. How we hold that in our hands, if we squash it or if we hold it gently in our hands, it's going to make a huge difference in how they perceive their willingness to be vulnerable in the future, and also how they perceive the church, how they perceive God in all of this as well. I think of my daughters. There's times where I'm trying to teach my daughters, like, when you are struggling with someone, I'm a safe person to come and talk to. But there are times, and I've got to be honest as I can be on social media, right? I have to be honest. There are times when I am not as gentle as I should be with their vulnerability.
Yeah.
When they come up to me and they are sharing their hurt with me, but it's a hurt that we've been arguing about, that I and my kids have been sort of fighting about. Sometimes I'm not as gentle with that as I should be. And it does a lot of damage in that moment.
Yeah.
If I had just been more gentle and received their vulnerability, and they said, Daddy, I'm angry about this, and they share their perspective, and if I just trample over that perspective immediately and say, well, that's not valid because of this, then I just shut the door, right?
Yeah.
But if I take the time to listen and I'm gentle with what is being communicated, even if I don't agree with it initially, right? If I take it and cradle it in my hands and give them an opportunity to be heard, that makes all the difference in the world.
Yes. Yes. Oh, so good. That really reminds me when we talk about these race issues, you know, we can talk about black and white race issues. You can talk about Filipino and Indonesian issues. You can talk about Muslim and Christian. I mean, just in any regard. And when someone invalidates what you're saying by, oh, I can't be. No, you know what? You just need to get over that. Are we talking about this again, please? I don't even want to hear you. You know, those sort of things hurt. You won't open up again. We almost need to teach how to empathize in church and Sabbath schools and just families in general. It's very powerful because you talk about it with your girls. Wow, if they don't learn that from you and Sarah, I mean, there's this really good poem from last week when I talked about generations that someone sent me, Floyd. And can I read that? Can I read this poem that he sent?
I'd love to hear.
He said, when we talk about children and listening and with our children, or even marriage, just in church in general, this is a poem by Ken Medina, and it goes like this. If this is not a place where tears are understood, where do I grow to cry? If this is not a place where my spirits can take wing, where do I go fly? If this is not a place where my questions can be asked, where do I go to seek? If this is not a place where my feelings can be heard, where do I go to speak? If this is not a place where you'll accept me as I am, where can I go to be? If this is not a place where I can try and learn and grow, where can I just be me? If this is not a place where tears are understood, where can I go cry?
Oh, wow. What a powerful, powerful message.
Yeah.
Wow. And you know, if we say this a lot, because I think it's absolutely true. If there's any place where people can come to cry and to have their feelings understood and to be able to voice their questions and their hurt and be gently received, it should be the church, right?
Yeah.
It should be the church, because that's, you see how Jesus responded. We are people who are following Christ, and you see how Jesus responded to those who are hurt. He could say some terrible things to people who are hurt, but instead he comforts them. He cares for them in that moment. And man, the church should be a place of compassion and care. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. It was really, really moving when I heard that. So I think we'll try and post that here for everyone to see that. Joy, I'd like to ask you a few more questions. You quoted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in your sermon, and just a beautiful quote. And I'm going to read the quote before I ask my question. The first question which the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Good Samaritan reversed the question, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? So how does this reversal help in this discussion?
Yeah, I think it's powerful because a lot of times our conversation about race, and this is the point that I make during my sermon, a lot of times this conversation about race becomes about like my needs, my wants, what I'm going through, my experience. right? Instead of focusing on the other person's needs, wants, and experience. And that's really what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is emphasizing. That Good Samaritan, he could have very well been thinking, well, yeah, it would be nice to help this guy, but it might be unsafe. The robbers might be there. It's going to be a lot of burden. It's going to cost me money. He could have focused on his own inconveniences, but instead, in that moment, he decided, instead of focusing on my inconvenience, thinking, well, what will happen to this man if I walk away?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, in our cross-racial conversations, that really should be the question: is what is going on with them? What is I loved a quote that Anita Roberts shared in our prayer connection earlier tonight. She said, the empathy, one definition for empathy is your pain in my heart. Your pain in my heart. And I think that's so beautiful, is that now your pain isn't just your pain. It's, I'm going to experience your pain. I'm going to try to feel what you're feeling so that I can empathize with you, right? Your pain in my heart. And that's what he did. He had that empathy. Said, if it were my son lying dead on the side of the road, I would want someone to stop. If I were lying dead on the side of the road, I would want someone to stop. So I'm going to stop and help you.
I think the psychological term I also think of is the bystander effect, where if enough people view an accident or a scene, everyone assumes someone else is going to help.
Yeah.
Oh, someone's probably going to help them because there's so many people going by. And yet people have died because they are left literally bleeding in an accident or other kinds of things because everyone assumes someone else will. Our chief, Randy Roberts, he said this a few times, and he said, how do you know when it's your turn to get involved in something? If you have the solution. And so if you have a potential solution for something and you can answer this, hey, jump in. Someone pushes you aside, okay, then you got to go. But otherwise, just don't assume someone's going to help. If you see it there,
yeah, that man's a pretty wise guy.
He is.
That Randy Roberts.
What a wise guy! What a wise guy.
No, I love that, because then in this dynamic, it's not just the responsibility of the system, of society, of other people to fix this. It's my responsibility. What piece can I play in bringing more equality to the country, and also what role can I play in reconciliation between races? Like, how do I contribute to that?
Hey, now let's end with maybe just a very practical question, Joey. What are some practical ways to support one another in cross-cultural relations in churches, neighborhoods, and places that we live?
I think one way is to begin with awareness. Before we even enter into these conversations, it's good to be aware of the ways that our own cultures impact us. And that's sort of been a journey for me as well. Is just to figure out how my background, my perspective, how I view things, colors the way that's different than other people view things. I realize this most clearly when I travel, right? When you go to another country, all of a sudden you realize, wow, the way that I think is not the way that everybody around the world thinks. It's just very different, right? Philip, as an immigrant coming to this country, you probably experienced a little bit of that before. Like, what are some of those moments where you, what are some American cultural things that you sort of ran into when you came here, or that you thought was unusual?
I think I was too young to almost process it through the immigrant lens. I think my brother and sister viewed their lives like, we're not from this place. They were teenagers. I was 3. But I think of a few things being food. I thought everyone would love sour, we call it kiselo mleko, which is soured yogurt, sour milk. I thought everyone would love that.
Sour milk. That
Yeah.
sounds like the thing that you throw away when it's been in your refrigerator for too long.
Just different things, but we would make a homemade yogurt. That's what it is in essence. It's homemade yogurt, but the direct translation is sour milk. And I made it a few times for my roommates, different time periods, and they're like, oh gosh, this is the best, and so food was one of those things. Coming to America is like, man, different palate. You guys don't really have a very good palate. Oh man, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it's true. And it's also funny how there is almost an inherent bias, and we don't think this out loud. I don't think we ever think this out loud, and if we do, we say it very quietly, which is that the way that I do things is the best way.
Yeah.
Right? Like the foods that I eat and that I like should be the foods that everybody likes, or the way that I approach family or my family approach that was the best way, right? Like there's almost an inherent bias that the way I do things is the best way to do things. It was interesting. I was reading this this book called Disunity in the Church by Christina. I forgot her last name. I'll have to post it later if people are interested. But she was talking about how they did a study where they just put a list of nonsense words like ziu, xiu, or gui, gwe, just random letters, right? And then they showed them to people with a pronoun in front, like my gu and your z. And what they discovered when they did this was that nobody knew what these words meant, but people said that the words that had the personal pronouns like mine or ours just sounded better. Were more pleasant to hear. So just by putting that pronoun in front of it, of mine, ours, we identified it as ours, and all of a sudden it just sounds better. So we have this inherent bias. All of us have this. It just doesn't matter where we're from, right? I go to Korea, and Korea, it's definitely the same thing. There is this inherent bias, like the way we do things, like why those silly Americans, why do they do things differently than us, right? There is an inherent bias.
I would give a few suggestions on top of those, maybe, Joey, and how can we support one another in these cross-cultural, cross-racial conversations. I would say just simply have them at least.
Mm-hmm.
I think be willing to be open to new relationships of people who are different races than you. Go love on a Hispanic church member in your church. Go love on a Filipino. Go love on that white dude that's over there that has the funny beard. Go love on that African American woman who has those 2 kids that come and they run around in church. Just be open to at least conversing with the different. We're so used to being in spaces where we feel comfortable, but God needs us to be in the uncomfortable, especially in church, because everyone feels kind of a little bit uncomfortable when they're alone and they feel isolated. And what if you could be the bridge that would bless people? And I like what you're saying, Esther. I think go love on the person that's older than you or younger than you. At least be willing to say hello, get to know them, give of yourself to the conversation to even happen.
That's so beautiful, Philip, because the less we know about someone, again, like we talked about at the beginning, the more we assume about them. So the way to break that is to get to know people, right? The more we know people, the less we're going to assume about them. And that's really where the compassion piece kicks in, is because if we were going to get to know someone, if the goal is to really understand them, then we have to start with compassion. We have to start with the desire to consider and to care for their experience, what they are going through, right?
Yeah.
That compassion piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Joe, I know I've kept you up late enough. But thank you so much. Such great insights that you shared with us, not only in the sermon, but even tonight at this Q&A. I know our viewers really appreciated that. Do you want to have any last words that you want to just share with people watching right now?
I just want to say thank you for being a part of this conversation, being willing to engage in this, because like Philip was saying, it's not an easy conversation to have. It's almost a minefield conversation to have. But wow, if we could really just give each other the benefit of the doubt, to care for each other and have these conversations, how much better as a church we would be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Joey, now I do know someone asked a really practical question at 9:15, really early on. Jackie Gonzalez, she said, did foot washing happen already? When is our church doing foot washing again?
So communion is going to be happening at the end of July. So we're going to have a communion service at the end of July. However, because we are physically distanced, we're not able to do foot washing service at our church. So you can do that at home. Just get a bowl and have the ordinance of humility with your family members at home.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Pastor Joey. Thank you, all of you who watched. We love you, appreciate you. So grateful to have you from all over the world. Thank you for watching from South America, South Africa, and all over Southern California. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whenever you watch this. Blessings to you. We'll see you next week.